Kim, welcome to Constituting America's Constitutional Chats. I'm going to turn it over to you for your opening remarks, and then we'll go to questions.
Well, hi, Kathy. And I'm just so thrilled to be here with all of you, to be here with you, Kathy, with you, Janine, who some of you may know, I actually have a house in Alaska these days. This was in no small part because I was so inspired by watching Northern Exposure when I was younger. So great to be here with the panel. It's exciting to get to talk to a group of young Americans, especially ones that I'm hoping, unlike my own kids, probably won't interrupt me or tell me I'm full of it. Also excited, such an amazing topic, the American dream. You know, if you were simply born in this country, you have in some ways already won the lottery because you've already been given something that the vast majority of humanity, past or current, doesn't have, and that is all the elements necessary to succeed. One of my favorite anecdotes actually comes from P.J. O'Rourke, who was a very funny guy. He sadly passed away a few years ago, but he told the story of his 10-year-old daughter who was always complaining that things weren't fair. And his response was, you know, honey, you're cute. That's not really fair. Your family's pretty well off. That's not really fair. But mostly you were born in America, and that's definitely not fair. So you'd better pray that things don't start getting fair for you. If you think about it, for hundreds of years, the number one place that everyone has wanted to come so badly, they were willing to say goodbye to family they might never see again, to get on ships or rafts and rough seas and risk disease and quarantine to come with nothing to America. They still do today. And you have to wonder what it is. And I'd like to argue that a lot of it comes down to something that too often gets overlooked when we talk about what makes this extraordinary country so unique, so amazing. And that is, in my mind, economic freedom. You know, the American dream is multifaceted and every aspect of it is important. We as society tend to largely talk about it in the big words: liberty, hope, opportunity, freedom. Or we talk about the big ticket features of our structure and our Constitution, which make America unique and that our founders were genius about, and that enable liberty and that hope and that opportunity that is the basis of the American dream. The separation of powers, federalism, the Bill of Rights, specific protections within it, like the First Amendment and freedom of religion and the right to a fair trial. All of these are essential to the American dream. But economic liberty, that's the piece that I worry does not get the attention it deserves, because it's also a founding feature of this country, something that the original drafters of the Constitution believed in fiercely and built many other rights around. Capitalism, free markets, individual free enterprise. Don't ever forget that excessive taxation of commerce helped spark the revolution. And so when we talk about the Constitution and the principle of limited government, for the founders, the main driver of that limit of government that they believed in was their fierce desire to have free commerce. America is rooted in the belief that individuals are better suited to determine their needs and their aspirations, and that the millions of individual economic choices that combine to make an economy are always much better than government prescription. We actually have safeguards in our Constitution to protect that economic freedom. We have the 5th and the 14th Amendments, which prohibit government from taking private property without due process of law. We have the Commerce Clause, which is designed to make sure that while states had vast power over their own doings, they didn't have the ability to create a patchwork of rules that interfered with the movement of goods or sparked trade wars or prohibited commerce in other states. We have the Privileges and Immunities Clause, a very, very broad protection, but which, among other things, protects the right to earn an honest living. So economic freedom and the safeguarding of it, even the founders understood, was essential to what we now call the American dream in all kinds of obvious ways. When individuals have property rights, they have the ability to take risks and make investments and create jobs, innovate, export, accumulate wealth. And the production of that wealth becomes a virtuous circle that enables yet more risk and more innovation and more success. Think about how many companies out there that you just have as common names in your head: Ford, Walmart, Amazon, Google, Boeing. They all started with one guy, an idea, and a little bit of seed money. But that guy, what he had in America, and part of the American dream, was the security of knowing that if he invested his money and he achieved success, the gain would be his own and that of his workers and his communities and his financial backers, but it wouldn't go to government. And this virtuous circle has been the engine that has propelled the American dream for years. It defines this country. When we think about people from other countries and what they imagine when they imagine the American dream, they're thinking of all those images of Wall Street traders yelling on the floor and business tycoons and the building of grand public libraries and mansions and the investors who built railways across this country and created steamships, and then the internet and cell phones. And yet, for all that reputation, the thing I worry about is that people forget just how intrinsic this bedrock principle is for economic freedom and entrepreneurialism, but also for all of our other rights, and therefore the broader concept and the basis of the American dream. Think about it for a minute. How could you possibly safeguard the right to free speech if the government had the ability at any time to say that it owned all the nation's printing presses? How could you realize that piece of the American dream that's owning your own home if at any moment the government could come and take it on the grounds it had a more pressing use for your property? How could you go to the university you wanted and study for the career you desired if government rules and regulations dictated what industries would exist and exactly how many workers would be allowed into each field? And if you think about it, this foundational principle of economic freedom and prosperity underpins almost every aspect of what we broadly think of as the American dream. The American dream is living in safety and security and not worrying that we face invading adversaries. And that comes about through the extraordinary investments and innovations and success behind our military power. The American dream is thinking of a future in which you build that piece of land and house and it's yours because of your property rights. The American dream is planning for your success and hoping your own kids see success beyond you, which is a function of work and savings and educational opportunities, but also the constant flourishing of new industries that provide new opportunities. We have in this country, and it's part of the American dream too, this constant, always constant increase in the standard of living. There was a day when the average middle-class family felt it was a luxury to own a single TV. Think about that compared to today. Think about the books you buy on Kindle, the freshness of your produce, the miracle of refrigeration, cars with AC. You used to have to roll down the windows. Phones that don't have to be hooked up to a wall with a cord and that don't need electrical sparks to dial. I actually grew up with that. Medical innovation. I mean, I speak passionately on this one. I have had family members that have been given, real sentences of possible death. And we've got an extraordinary biotech community that has invested billions and is now beating things like cancer. I would argue that alongside elections, the ability to vote people in and out of government, economic freedom is the most powerful tool for expressing disapproval of government and forcing change. Consider just the powers of economic freedom combined with federalism and states' rights. In the past 4 years, we've seen massive migration across the country, people fleeing high tax, high regulation states to go buy homes and start businesses in places that provide them more economic liberty. And yet, again, I worry that unlike free speech or freedom of religion, this is an area where the rights are being chipped away. When we talk about growth of government, and we've had enormous growth of government in recent years, almost all of it, if you think about it, is aimed at curtailing economic freedom. Think about those alphabet soup of agencies in DC. They largely exist to issue new rules against businesses. And, we've done this in part because at one point we suckered ourselves into believing that we needed all of this for our well-being and safety, that we need these complex labor laws to govern relationships between businesses and people. We need these complicated rules about medical trials that stretch on for decades and sometimes deny people a chance for a cure. We can certainly have a discussion about whether some minimal rules of the road aren't required. But I do worry if you ask any entrepreneur what they say their biggest risk is to their success is today. It's not the market or a worry about getting seed capital, it's government. And even more dangerous, I think we've been wandering into territories recently where we think government might actually supplant entire industries, for instance, running healthcare. The problem is that they are not those millions of amazing entrepreneurial people out there. Government is, by its very definition, anti-innovation and anti-efficiency. And I would challenge you to try to think of a single product it has ever created that compares to anything in the market, or that it's delivered half as well. I want you to imagine just for a minute, as I finish up here, as we were describing a similar government assault on other core rights. If the government were trying to take over that level of our freedom when it came to freedom of speech, or that level of our autonomy when it came to religion, there would be furious blowback. You couldn't move for the lawsuits, and rightly so. But we are less passionate about defending threats to economic freedom. And that's my message. I think we need to regain that passion that we have for other rights. John Locke enlightened us as to our notion of natural rights, rights that precede even the establishment of civil society: life, liberty, and property. And in that latter, to me, is everything that really underpins the American dream. And to keep that dream alive, we have to remember how essential economic freedom is, and our fight for it just as hard as we do the other rights that sustain our amazing country.
Well, thank you. Those were great opening comments. And I think you're so right. It does seem that we fight a lot harder for some of the other rights, and so often just let the economic freedom begin to slip away. So, but I'm going to turn it over to Janine. Janine, I know you've got a lot of questions lined up, and we're going to hand it off to you.
Great, great. Well, why am I not surprised, Kimberly Strassel, that was a brilliant opening? I'm watching thinking, oh, this is a classic piece. This is really great. Everything she's just saying, this is like a time capsule of great, profound, wisdom. You talked about something. Of course, I'm a bit of a nerd when it comes to founding documents and founding fathers and all the philosophers and whatnot. But I was going to actually hone in on that. Our Declaration of Independence says life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. But it always was originally life, liberty, and property. Right. And I've been talking, with my daughter too, about just there's physical property, and just how we have the right to own property. That was one of the reasons so many people came over, because it was higher. There was an aristocracy that was passed down. They couldn't sell off those lands. People didn't have the right to buy any of the lands, and so property in itself is an American dream. I think, just to own land or a house or something of your own. But property is so much broader, and you touched on all of this. I think the thing, since my dad was a West Point graduate in the Air Force, and so I kind of had a plethora of ideas roaming around my head, but I've been primarily sort of a Hollywood actor, right? And then when you step into this genre, a lot of these words and a lot of these things are a bit confusing to people, kind of that, the DC speak, So I think it'd be interesting to talk, and you touched on this, but property means so many other things, doesn't it, within the American dream? The Constitution gives us the right to own, the copyright to our intellectual ideas. And that then gives people the economic freedom to be able to grow. But you want to talk about that a little bit? Just that didn't happen. If you created something wonderful in overseas in Europe or wherever you were, that went to the king, you didn't have the right to own it. And here we can reap the benefits of our own sort of, our founding fathers talked about the genius of the people, our own genius. That's a property.
Such a totally vital point, and something, I'm so glad you brought back on this, because I was actually going to meditate on this a little bit in my opening remarks, but I was going on too long. So it's so important when we talk about the founders, and you're right about that point about how it was changed to the pursuit of happiness, and in part, by the way, because founders did want to express this broader concept that you are talking about right now, that property isn't just an estate somewhere, a farm, a piece of land. It was broadly viewed as encompassing anything that you owned that could create value or compete in the marketplace or allow you to obtain property. So property includes your labor, your capital, your ideas, as you were just noting, some of that's encompassed in other statutes and laws like copyright law, for instance. You know, I mentioned another clause in the Constitution, the Privileges and Immunities Clause, since we're going to geek out a little on the Constitution. But you know, one of the justices that really helped define that in a seminal judicial ruling on the Supreme Court, Justice Bushrod Washington, and he wrote, "The right to acquire and possess property of every kind and to pursue and obtain happiness and safety. The right of citizen of one state to pass through or to reside in any other state for purposes of trade, agriculture, professional pursuits, or otherwise. To take, hold, and dispose of property, either real or personal, may be mentioned as some of the particular privileges and immunities of citizens." And I think that really gets to your point. That's a fuller description of what it means. And so when we talk about property rights, this is just so important. And it's why it's so intrinsically linked to all the other rights that we talk about more frequently. You know, your right to free speech is intrinsically related to your ability to voice not just your issues about political concern, but your creative ideas, for instance, that we can then protect and you can make money from. I mean, think about all the influencers out there who basically make money because they talk a lot, and that is all encompassed under this broad rubric of your right to personal property, your right to property.
You know, it's interesting to compare that. When we one of our multi-tiers, many programs at Constituting America is we speak and we go into the schools and speak with the students, and one of the things that I think is really pivotal to teach them is there are a billion plus people in China, right? So you can easily say that there are more than a billion people across the world today that do not have these rights that we have. And that it's something that we could lose easily if we don't understand divided government, you know, the way the checks and balances, the elements that are so important to prevent anarchy or tyranny or things that will take this away. I think it would be interesting to juxtapose. I was going to juxtapose. Is that right? Juxtapose?
Yes.
Okay, good. The two communism and what they do with property, which is, you know, is taken over some of South America. Communism is there. Communism in China. China has its eye on America. There's so many other countries that then you have dictatorships like in North Korea or Iran or wherever it may be. But I kind of consider myself a scholar of sort of the Russian communist era. And so I'm very familiar with it. And I think one of those reasons is because my father was on alert all the time to fly the B-58 Hustler during the Cold War. And so it's sort of in my DNA, like Ronald Reagan says, you know, it's just in the air. But communism doesn't give you the right to any of this at all. And neither do dictators. And I think it's George Washington said, you know, the problem with democracy is that you don't really realize, you can't really understand something until you've experienced it. So everyone's just so busy experiencing freedom, they don't really understand what it's really like. It's like, oh, you're just telling stories, you know, until you really experience it. But I mean, you want to talk about what happened in communist Russia and communist China? Lastly, I filmed a movie in communist China in 1983, right? We're talking, you know, and one of the actors had lived through the Cultural Revolution, and he would just whisper in my ear and talk to me all the time about how horrific it was. But you do not have the right to property of any sort, you know, really, especially intellectual property and things of that nature, in communist societies. And they're kind of encroaching on us. And I don't think people really realize how close we are to losing this American dream.
Yeah, you know, and one thing I would point out, because I actually consider a victory for those of us who believe in economic freedom and property rights, is that some of those countries you're talking about now, in particular, communist Russia and communist China, while they continue to include elements of that. Well, not Russia as much anymore. It's an entirely different type of government structure, as it were, an oligarchy, as it were. But if you look at what still officially calls itself Communist China, even it is acknowledged that pure communism does not work from an economic perspective. It has adopted elements of a free market society because it understands the problems. Any experiment we've ever had in pure communism from an economic perspective has so devastated the economies of those that tried to do it, that they have had to introduce a watering down of it just to continue to survive and stay in power and not be overthrown by their starving people out there, because it was really that bad. I mean, and China actually had a version of that, as you just mentioned. But there's a couple of problems and how it works out. And the reason that people have had to do this is, first of all, when you have that sort of thing, there is no efficiency, and when you have no property rights, there's no building and there's no growth. I mean, it's the tragedy of the commons, which I'm sure many of your students have heard of as an intellectual idea. But if you have a tree, an area of forest, and anybody can go chop the trees down and nobody owns it, once those trees are gone, it'll never be restored again, because nobody has ownership, nobody has a stake in it, nobody's actually earning anything from it. So you have that. You just basically have a lack of any risk-taking and innovation because there's no drive for it. But what you also end up having is just a situation in which nobody is willing to also even engage, because why would you ever go and build something when you know that it could be taken from you at any moment? And that's what we're seeing in some South American countries at the moment. Venezuela, we have Western companies that were down there, for instance, engaged in fossil fuel extraction and different types of ventures, and the Venezuelan government came in and erased their rights and took over their property, took over their facilities. And that is just a signal to the world: don't touch this country, don't engage in this place. So one reason too, we have so many people who actually flow here. Like, just think about the number of businesses we have that always want to list their companies, their foreign companies, on the US stock exchange. It's because they know that it's a safe place to build and grow their businesses, because they know that they're not going to lose everything they have someday down the road by a fickle government that just takes everything they've dreamed to build.
Well said. And in closing here, so I can toss to Tova. So I'm like, I don't know. Well, I think I'm over my time, but just briefly, just the way like Ayn Rand, right, in Atlas Shrugged and whatnot, how there's a slow encroachment on your ability to think and your ability to innovate and your ability to create. And then no one has the impetus to do it. To me, this is the great American dream. Why no one has the impetus to do anything if they don't get to own any of it? It's like, well, I'm just going to sit at home. Why bother? Why bother going? But in America, to me, the American dream is kind of like, starting out as a 15-year-old and trying to make it in Hollywood, right? It's a long journey, but I had that freedom to go do that. But to have an intellectual thought and have the opportunity to pursue it and not know. I mean, you know how it was in Russia. It's like, oh, you're sent off to the camp because your music sounds like you're passionate for the old regime. I mean, it cramps down on even the arts in just like in 30 seconds. If you want to talk about that.
It's very scary. And the thing is too, is that it's creeping. And that's what you say that scares me about the United States. I mean, just to give you an example, look at the medical field at the moment. We've gone from extraordinary freedom and medical innovation to now we're having a discussion about, well, maybe we're going to reduce the amount of time you have a copyright on that drug, because we think people should be able to get it cheaply, quicker. And now we're having a conversation about entire classes of drugs. Maybe we'll put price controls on them because we just feel they're really important items that people have. I can understand how people fall for that idea and think that that's a good thing, because, everyone should have their drugs at affordable prices. But if that is our imperative as a country, we have to think of a way to do it in which we as a people are underwriting the cost of that and sending it to people, rather than crimping and destroying the ability of those who are building the products and innovating and marketing them and using the money they create to pour it back into yet more innovation.
Yeah, that's right. Money leads to more innovation and bigger and better things. Okay, I have to toss to Tova. I could ask you questions all day, but thank you so much. And Tova, you're on.
Hi, thank you so much for your time and for being on today. And I think you gave a really great overview of kind of what the conception of the American dream is and how that manifests. But I wanted to ask, about Americans' attitudes towards the American dream, because, I was researching in a recent survey by the Wall Street Journal and the National Opinion Research Center found, and I was surprised to see this, based off of all you said, that only 36% of voters actually said that the American dream still holds true. And that was down from 53%, so more than half, who believed that in 2012 and even 48% in 2016. So 12% drop just since 2016. My question is kind of twofold. One is, what do you think accounts for that decrease in confidence? Because I also compared it with other surveys, and it seems like it is a real decrease in confidence in the American dream. But then my second question is, do you think that's warranted, or do you think that there's a discrepancy between public belief in the American dream and our actual prospects to achieve it?
Yeah, so that, by the way, doesn't necessarily surprise me. And I would argue that there's probably, like, right now, maybe two broad reasons for it. I mean, and I think it underlines what I was saying about how economic freedom and economic success is such a bedrock element of what people think when they think of the American dream. We're having a very hard time in our economy right now for a lot of people to get by. We've had this extraordinary levels of inflation due to government overspending. It has made the cost of buying groceries and paying your rent and paying for your energy bills extremely punishing for many, many people. We talked a little bit, the American dream for many people, a vital aspect of it is buying your own first home. Well, when you have high inflation rates, the way that the federal government attempts to deal with this central bank is to actually raise borrowing rates and the interest rates that go up. And so now, if you're a first-time home buyer in your 20s or your 30s, you're looking at paying a mortgage of 7 or 8%. It's out of reach for many people. And so I can certainly see how that would be a knock to many people's belief in their economic future and the American dream. I think combined with that, we've also had a loss of faith in many of America's core institutions, given political scandal and upheaval, everything from what went on with the FBI a few years ago, and worries about justice departments and prosecutors engaging in elections, just a general sort of lack of trust in Congress and what it's doing. And I think that when people have a worry about institutions in America, they worry about the longer term stability of America, and that also concerns them in terms of the American dream. So I do think that, like, in the very short term, that view is understandable. At the same time, I look and I am occasionally just blown away at how, despite the regulations and despite the sort of onslaught at times against economic freedom, just how resilient and innovative and entrepreneurial Americans remain, constantly trying to come up with the new best widget or get around something, and they figure out how to make it work. So I think we ought to have a lot more optimism in the long term, although we should also be very aware of decisions that we are making and the risks that they may have to that longer term outcome.
Yeah, that was a really well said answer. So to summarize, would you say that you think that this decrease in confidence in the American dream is warranted, or do you think it's overblown, although still some aspects of it are warranted?
So I think, yeah, Toba, I think, like, some of it's understandable, I guess is the word that I would use, is that when people look at their own pocketbook and they're not getting ahead, in fact, they're going backward, it is inevitable that they will wonder about their future and their ability to gain success, which is at the heart of the American dream. But with luck and fortune and hopefully some steady guides, this country has a remarkable ability to swing a pendulum back. when things go down the wrong road and get back on the right track. And while I think that we have made some very poor decisions in recent years in terms of government overspending and too much regulatory burden on companies, that's also something that is expressed in that poll, and the kind of displeasure that sometimes causes people to go to the polls and make a different decision to try to send the pendulum back the other way.
Got it. And I really liked how you were touching on the economic aspects of the American dream. But I was curious about this idea of upward economic mobility, which I think is kind of what a lot of people think of when they think of the economic aspects of the American dream. So, my life, my economic prospects will be better than those of my parents, and that's been pretty fundamental. I mean, that is what drives immigration, people to come here, establish a better life for their children. And as I was, researching and reading up for this chat, I saw that there's a lot of research that actually absolute mobility, which is the chances that a child born into poverty rises to a higher standard of living than their parents, has actually been in a continuous decline since the 1980s, at least according to the studies I read. So when absolute mobility is measured using comparing a child's household incomes at age 30, adjusted for inflation with the consumer price index, comparing that to their parents' household incomes at age 30, absolute, mobility has actually fallen from around 90% for children born in 1940. So 90% of children would have at 30 a higher income than their parents. And now it's only around 50% for children born in the 1980s. So roughly half and half. Does this represent a decline in the economic aspects of the American dream, or do you dispute that, or do you think that there's some other explanation or way to measure the American dream that's more accurate?
So yeah, no, first of all, I mean, so some of those studies can be really useful at telling us broadly what's going on. And I think you're right, and I do think that we have steadily over the years added regulatory burdens, tax burdens. We haven't really talked about the tax aspect of this as well too, which is another giant lever that often can undermine economic freedom and the American dream. There are also, you can look at also studies of quintiles where they look at more specific sort of earners and how they fare over years. And we still do have, I think the good news is people moving up and down those quintiles. And another thing I just mentioned about the American dream, which I think is really important, and people understand this, is an aspect of the American dream and the opportunity of the United States is that sometimes you don't just go up, sometimes you go back down. All of those people I were talking about, those innovators, a lot of them did not succeed on their first go rounds of their ventures, of their companies. And one of the most amazing things about America is that you're allowed to fail here. In fact, we admire you sometimes when you go out and you start a company and it blows up and it didn't work, and then you try the next thing. I lived in Europe for years, and they do not have the same embrace of economic freedom that we do. And one of the fundamental flaws of the way they think about capitalism is that if you fail over there, you are damaged goods. You are basically done. You don't get another shot at raising capital. And that's different in the United States. So we do have these quintiles. I think generally we do see real movement still in and among the quintiles. So that's a different way of looking at specific things. But broadly, I think you're right. There is some real concern about household income and the barriers today to achieving the things that our parents and grandparents did. And that, to me, to my point, comes entirely down. It's not a function of capitalism not working. It's not a function of the free market not working. It's entirely a direct correlation with government inserting itself more and more into the marketplace and making it a little bit harder for people to achieve, invest, save, and innovate.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for that, really thorough overview. I only have 30 seconds left, so I won't ask another question, but thank you for your time. And I'll pass on to the next person.
Thanks for the show. I think it's coming at a great time in our nation, and it's so uplifting to think of when you consider not just how our culture and society is built and all of the issues with it, but looking at it in a real sense of comparing it to somewhere else and realizing that while we have these issues that we should be working very hard to fix and improve, that we are still an anomaly in world history for economic freedom. And I also wanted to mention as well that the focus on understanding the importance of lost time, and it is there's a certain amount of justice that comes from a man being able to reap the benefits of his labor, and that's part of what that natural right of to work and to see the rewards of that work and to not have an undue burden put on that work. So I guess one of the questions I want to say is could you do you think that talked a little, things have gotten worse and some things have gotten better, but as someone starts off in business right now, there is quite a bit of red tape and there is quite a bit of liability and there's quite a bit of things that are, maybe just get a W-2 job. So could you talk about maybe some of the ways that some of the benefits of small business and some of the ways we should be encouraged to try to start them and some of the ways that we should be encouraged to reduce red tape on starting them?
Yeah, it is such an excellent question. And thank you for asking it. One of the things I didn't make the distinction between, and I think it is really important, is sometimes when we think of business these days, we think of these very big corporations that sometimes can be a bit faceless, who also irritate us when we, call into their automated phone system and have to go through 37 menus or whatever it is. And we don't have much sympathy for them as a result, because we feel like they don't have much care sometimes for us. But, the vast majority of economic activity out there on a day-to-day basis is still performed by these incredible millions of small business owners. And, I feel privileged. My dad owned a small business. He was an auto mechanic and he fixed cars for a living, but he had his own business. My husband is a small business owner. He owns a metal fabrication business here in Alaska. He designs equipment for North Slope people. When you look at what they had to do to get through, the OSHA visits and the tax requirements and with withholding and the safety and the disability issues and the workers' comp and that's before specific agencies that are tasked in their particular field with environmental quality issues and water quality issues and everything else. That it can be a real discouragement to people to even try to start a business. So, I think and that's, by the way, also taxes. I love the word you use about this sort of justice of working hard and keeping the fruits of your labor. One question I always pose to people is, so let's just think about this. Would you go to, if you could go work, let's say you already work 60 hours a week, okay? And you have the opportunity to work 10 more hours. Would you do that if you were taxed at the same amount you are now? Probably. Would you do it if you were taxed at 20% higher on those last 10 hours than you are now? Maybe not. So when you raise those tax rates, is a discouragement to people because they feel they are not keeping the work and the fruit of their labor. So you're right. I mean, the list of codes and regulations and inspectors that deal with small business is insane. States have been doing a better business job of trying to get rid of some of this, but the most extraordinary thing to me is the interaction the federal government has with small businesses on a Main Street level. And you think about how far away that is from when the founders viewed the states should be pretty much in charge of all of their local commerce and that they were supposed to be there basically to maintain a standing military and a currency. And now they are in every aspect of every small business owner's life. And we need to rethink that entirely.
Yeah, thank you. It's awesome to hear of your dad's small business and your husband's small business and just about the backbone of American innovation and self-determinism and being able to there was such a spirit of the homestead, a spirit of the frontier, a spirit of property, and a love of that property that built really our nation from the ground up. Um, another kind of totally different topic is as far as the think about how to word this quickly. In businesses in general, there's of the money that's made of businesses and how much goes to labor, how much goes to executives, and the disparity between that. How much is due to how much of the issues that we'll hear talk about are these hot button problems or political controversy? How much of it has to do with people being able to represent themselves, and how much does it have to do with government intervention or regulation that creates a system where that's a system that encourages that type of a system? And how much is just this is one of the things you accept for the benefits of a capitalist society?
So I'm actually going to surprise you and say something that was actually not one of your options. But by the way, I do think, for the record, I mean, you mentioned the question about being able to represent yourself. That's a question of unionism. I do find it really interesting that to this day, in most scenarios, when workers are presented with the option of joining a union and they hear the arguments on both sides, for the most part, they choose not to go down that road because they generally tend to feel as though they can obtain for themselves higher wages and better benefits, not under the umbrella of that kind of a leadership. I do think that there are certain kinds of government rules and incentives, definitely, that cause manipulations of normal economic principles, or I should say, unexpected consequences that have also served to raise, for instance, corporate, executive pay versus regular worker pay. But you want to know who I blame the most for this? Because as much as I am celebrating business here today, and I absolutely am, and economic freedom, big business does not do itself any favors at times, okay? I think that unfortunately, too often the CEOs of our big companies, they've forgotten about their job, first of all, of being warriors and messengers of the importance of economic freedom, because many of them have become dependent on government subsidies, for instance. They want handouts, so they tend not to stand up for this stuff. And I think that they have also lost touch, some of them, especially in these corporations where you see the largest gaps between executive pay and worker pay. They have lost sight to a certain degree about what makes for happy, innovative workforces. And, one great thing about the market is that oftentimes when you get companies like that are that out of touch, they fall of their own accord. They make problems of their own making, and they can't recover from them. And, but this is where I also dislike the thumb of government, because there are a bunch of businesses out there who have made poor economic decisions, who have not done enough to invest in their workforces and maintain worker loyalty and help their communities. And to the extent that they're still thriving, it's because government's giving them money to stay into business, and they are therefore interfering with the market and what ought to be otherwise happening. I think we need a business class that remembers itself the powers of economic freedom and becomes a little bit more livers of that experience.
One more comment as we're coming down to the end of my time. Was another awesome answer. Is I've seen a few times a talk by Milton Friedman, and he holds up a pencil and he talks about basically the miracle of the market in creating pencil,
Yes.
and where pieces come from. The efficiency, the creativity that brings our products to market and allows us to obtain them for still in many cases extremely cheap is incredible. So I wanted to leave my segment with that, and if you're familiar with it, if you wanted to comment on it.
Yeah, I love the pencil story. The pencil story is magnificent. Everyone should go look up the I pencil story and about the how that just encapsulates the beauty of the market. But I would, just because you mentioned Milton Friedman, he's one of my favorite people. He was one of my favorite people of all time. The flip side of it is how he talks about how government, by contrast, ruins everything it touches. And my favorite line he ever had is, if you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert, in 5 years, there would be a shortage of sand.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jewel and
I
Toa.
just want, and Kathy, I just want to pop in and say one thing about that wonderful, wonderful message about the government big businesses taking money from the government, and then they're sort of hand tied. I have a word for that: golden handcuffs. Right?
Yep,
It's like
absolutely.
golden handcuffs, and then you can't speak your mind anymore either. That was really a good point. Okay, I'm passing over to you, Kathy, and for our guest, Alex.
Yes, we're going to get to Professor Tokarov in just a moment, but first we want to give a quick shout out to the students watching with us today. We have Natalie Guerrero and quite a few University of Texas at Arlington students on watching, so thank you to all the UTA students out there. D'Angela Hines with students from Emerald Coast Christian Academy, and Cami Waynouse with her homeschool student Kenyon. So thank you to all the students who are with us. And we are so excited to have our audience member with us today on camera, Professor Alex Tokarov, who's one of our regular Constitutional Chats listeners. He promotes our contest to all his students. He's had at least 2 contest winners from within his students. And Professor Tokarov is professor of economics and philosophy at Michigan's Northwood University. He grew up in Bulgaria under socialism and received his PhD in economics from Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. So, Professor Tokarov, I think you're coming to us today from Bulgaria, actually. You're over there for a little while this summer.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
We can, if you could. Are you going to be able to turn on your camera?
Let me see. I don't see oh yeah, that's right. It was my fault. Hi. Greetings from Bulgaria. And yeah, I grew up in a small country in Southeast Europe. And at that time, Bulgaria was enslaved by the Soviet Union compared to America. And we could see what it was like in the movies. Life under socialism was miserable. 3 generations of Tokarevs shared a 1-bedroom apartment, and we were among the lucky ones. 25 years ago, my wife and I came to America to pursue our American dream. Initially, we thought that it was primarily about economic opportunity. Today, we have a nice house in Michigan with a big backyard for barbecues and games of soccer, 2 wonderful children who study business at Northwood University, and even a dog. As we accomplished our academic, professional, and material goals, we realized that none of those were possible without America's Christian values and free enterprise system. Under socialism, you could have all the money, respect, and power that comes with being a member of the political elite, but you would still be a slave. So let's keep our faith and our liberty so our children and their children can pursue the American dream. I'd like to wish everyone here a happy 4th of July. And my question for Kimberly tonight is, which is the bigger threat to the American dream? Is it a foreign enemy, such as the Chinese Communist Party's alliance with Russia's Putin, North Korea's Kim, and Iran's Ayatollah? Or is it domestic detractors, such as our political, business, educational, and entertainment elites?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to dodge it. I think they're equally a threat. I mean, in their own ways. And I don't want anyone to suggest that I'm comparing Americans to dictators, but they each pose their own threats. Let me say that. We cannot close our eyes to the fact that our adversaries overseas are moving and changing. There's a new world order going on, and I think it's very scary for me as a student of history. And I would assume you, having lived through this, There's some just very worrying signs out there, and I don't think we have done enough to deter some of the aggression and some of these new alliances. And obviously look at what's happening in Ukraine at the moment. I mean, we have emboldened people who are emboldened to take acts that we have not seen since the World War II era. It's very concerning. But I do think that there is a big risk that we've had a consolidation in this country, or a homogenization, let me say that, where we have always had elites in our society, but I don't know if we have ever had to the extent we see it now. And this is borne out in opinion polls, where the elites in our society who tend to hold a lot of levers of power, as you note, they run the bureaucracy in the government. They hold a lot of elected positions. They are at the top of the food chain in Hollywood. They are in the ivory towers and so many academic, where they are so uniformly homogenous, uniformly holding antipathy toward many of these basic ideas of the American dream and economic success. And so able to broadcast their views, in the media and elsewhere. By the way, a lot of those elites are also in the media or running the media. And so we have a very concerning, in my mind, lack of diversity of thought in many of our most powerful people in the country. And unfortunately, that lack of diversity of thought, they're all on the side, many are on the side of robbing us of some of these essential freedoms, which they claim that they're doing for the benefit of humanity, but it is nonetheless antithetical to a lot of the founding concepts and the American dream of this country.
Well, and thank you so much for joining us, Professor Tokarov. And we've got about 2 minutes left, so we're going to try to squeeze in an audience question. And you're welcome to stay on as well. And we want to thank our listeners on Las Vegas's KKVV 1060 AM. This program is aired on Monday evenings at 6 p.m. Pacific on Las Vegas's KKVV. So thank you for listening in Las Vegas. Kimberly, well, first, Paul Pierce says, what an awesome podcast. Miss Kimberly's opening remarks should be rebroadcast in every schoolroom and civic meeting of any kind. Congress should be required to listen to it. Well done. And speaking of classrooms, we have a couple of our listeners have asked what can be done to increase this type of education in K-12. I think I'm looking here. Let's see, Scott Faulkner had said, how do we embed knowledge of economic freedom into the K-12 curriculum? And then Julianne Smith had said, what action can be taken to increase the ability for the younger generations to achieve the American dream and reduce the trend Tova talked about?
Yeah, so I mean, I think in terms of classrooms, we just need a return to some of that more fundamental curriculum. I mean, I do remember when I was in high school having lessons about the differences between communism, fascism, different forms of societal organization and the problems inherent in those. And I remember having things like a personal finance class and sort of basic economics, but I don't think that we have enough of that anymore in the classroom, especially not an emphasis on basic economics and economic systems and how they work, and whether those become part of history classes or civics classes or whatever they are. I think we need to sort of our lawmakers and those engaged in the public education system need to put a little bit more thought into incorporating economic principles into the basic things that people understand. In terms of trying to reverse that trend that Tova mentioned, and it is concerning, we must step back and reevaluate, in particular, the federal government's engagement in business regulation and rules. It's extraordinary at this level. And we need to remember that, there was a time, back when I was young, where we had entire departments that didn't exist that exist now. And the country actually survived pretty well without them. You know, maybe we need to go beyond just saying we need to get rid of that rule and that rule to just being like, do we even need any of you people in that department anymore? Let's just, you know, knock it off, go away. And I bet you anything, the sky wouldn't fall. But I promise you, if we knock back a lot of that regulatory stuff, we have a very good basic statutory framework here in this country that does protect rights and liberties. And if we have strong private property rights as well, I think a lot of the things that people warn would happen if government wasn't there telling us what to do every second of the day are a bunch of fantasies. We would be perfectly okay.
Well, that's a great way to wrap up the show. And we just thank you so much for being with us. We were so honored to have you today. You're just fantastic. And Janine, do you have any parting words for us?
I just think this is just one of our highlight shows, Kimberly Strassel. So I'm just so in awe, and thank you much and very much, and all of our panel. And Alex, how great to hear your story. We wanted, you know, this is so fun that we asked our listeners to tell us how they want to celebrate America. And thank you for all the times you listen, and thanks for coming and sharing to celebrate the American dream with us today. What an amazing story you have, Alex.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Kimberly, I just want to close with this. We talked about the diversity of thought. I go back, you know, I was kind of touching on that earlier. It's just the ability, that's part of the life and liberty and pursuit of happiness or property. It's, if you can't have diversity of thought, and in the school systems, it's getting so monochronistic and pigeonholed about what people can learn. And I'm always like, give the kids 2 points of view, but give them 2 points of view, because that's how you have the dialectic, like Hegel talked about. You know, that's how you learn and grow and all of this. You have to have, and I think it's what our founding fathers had, with this ability to have all this information and just learn and grow without it being censorship.
No,
Lack of censorship is part of the American dream. In closing, don't you think?
freedom of speech. Look, I mean, the founding fathers did not set up a system in which they guaranteed we'd be funneled one view. They set up a system that guaranteed everyone can talk, because they fundamentally believed that if Americans heard of a diversity of viewpoints, they would come to the right decision in the end. So you are totally right. And by the way, but before I go, just thank you so much for inviting me to do this and letting me be part of such a special series and program, and everything you do is just so valuable. So it meant a lot to me to do this today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you everyone for watching. See you next
Yes.
week.
Next week, Tuesday 2, the American people.